Picture this. A packed night bus in Nigeria, heat trapped under a metal roof, bodies pressed together, the air thick with sweat, perfume, and the sour bite of fear. At the back sits a teenage boy with an exercise book on his knees. He's not reading a love letter. He's sketching a building. Clean lines, strong angles, like he's trying to draw order into a country that still feels like it's shaking. A man 2 seats away is loudly counting money into a preacher's palm, almost bragging about it, like the cash itself is holy. The boy watches, stomach turning. Is this what God looks like? An envelope passed hand to hand? And here's the ugly part. The preacher smiles like a butcher who knows the goat won't run. But the boy doesn't spit on faith. He spits on the cheap version of it. Because that boy grows into Pastor David Oyedepo, Bishop David Oyedepo, the man millions will call Papa, the founder of Winners Chapel, and one of the most polarizing religious figures in Nigeria, admired, imitated, criticized, and, by many, revered. Wikipedia. And if you think this story is just poor boy becomes famous pastor, you're about to get surprised, because the real battle isn't only with poverty or politics. It's with an enemy that wears a friend's face, the rival gospel that says faith is only real if it pays immediately. He arrives in the world on September 27, 1954, tied to places and names that already hint at a life lived between worlds. His roots trace to Omu Aran in Kwara State, yet he's also associated with Osogbo, a city that breathes with both tradition and restless change. Wikipedia. From the start, his home is not a simple church family story. It's a crossroads. On one side, a father described as a Muslim healer, a man connected to the idea that spiritual power can be practical, almost transactional. Wikipedia. On the other side, a mother tied to the cherubim and seraphim stream, Christian, prophetic, Yoruba-rooted, full of songs that feel like they can lift the roof off a room. Wikipedia. And then, like the first twist in a film, you meet the figure who becomes the quiet engine of his childhood, his grandmother, and the one who introduces him to a strict, almost unromantic kind of Christianity, not the dramatic kind, the disciplined kind. The kind that talks about giving, tithing, responsibility, faith that shows up in routine, not only in miracles. Wikipedia. In a country where survival can train people to grab what they can, a grandmother teaching a boy to release what he has. Money, pride, excuses can feel like madness. But this is how the story starts. Not with a pulpit, but with a pattern. And patterns matter, because Oyedepo's future message will be built like architecture: pillars, foundations, systems, repetition, and insistence that chaos can be organized, that a life can be engineered. He doesn't grow up in a soft world. Nigeria, in those decades, is a place where history moves loudly, political shifts, social tension, the pressure of making something out of little. For many young people, the dream isn't glory. It's stability, a job, a paycheck, a roof that doesn't leak. So the young Oyedepo does something that later makes his story feel almost inevitable. He chooses a path that is literally about structure. He studies architecture at Kwara State Polytechnic, earning a higher national diploma. Wikipedia. And for a moment, his life looks like it will be normal, almost boring in the best way. He works with the Federal Ministry of Housing in Ilorin. Wikipedia. Just imagine it. A young man with a steady job in a government ministry, paperwork, drawings, measurements, budgets. That's the kind of life that makes relatives relax. That's the kind of life that tells your neighbors, he's doing well. But here comes the tension. The more he learns how to build physical structures, the more a different question starts chewing at him from the inside. What if Nigeria's biggest problem isn't the lack of buildings, but the collapse of meaning? What if the real housing crisis is spiritual? People living inside fear, shame, and limitation. And that's where the enemy steps into frame. Not a person, at least not yet. A force, a culture, a competition for people's hearts. Because Nigeria doesn't have a shortage of religion. It has a surplus. Churches, mosques, prophets, Prayer houses, revivals, crusades, voices everywhere. Some voices heal, some voices hype, some voices manipulate. And in the noise, a young man trying to take God seriously faces a brutal reality. Faith can be used like a weapon. It can lift you up, or it can farm you. And the boy on the bus, the one who felt disgust watching money slide into a palm, doesn't forget that feeling. That mixed nausea and fascination. That question, is the sacred being sold? Here's the twist. That disgust doesn't push him away from ministry. It pushes him toward it. Because if the stage is already crowded, the ambitious man says, then I'll be louder. But the builder says, then I'll be stronger. And Oyedepo's story, from early on, carries the psychology of a builder. If the existing structure is flawed, don't complain. Build another. There is a claim associated with his spiritual timeline that he became born again as a teenager, around 1969, when he was about 15. Wikipedia. Whether you treat that as a precise moment or a symbolic marker, the point is this. His faith isn't a midlife pivot. It's a formative layer, something that grows as he grows. And growth, in Nigeria, is not gentle. You learn to negotiate power early. Social power, religious power, family power. You learn what people respect. You learn what they fear. You learn what they will follow. And somewhere in those years, Oyedepo is watching two competing gospels wrestle in real time. The gospel of endurance, faith as discipline, patience, moral backbone. The gospel of instant reward, faith as a vending machine. Insert prayer, receive cash. The second one is seductive because it speaks to hunger, but it can also rot people from the inside because it trains them to worship outcomes instead of truth. And in that tension, he starts sharpening a voice, not yet the global preacher voice, something raw, a young man forming convictions. He isn't famous yet. He isn't surrounded by an empire yet. There are no massive auditoriums in this phase of the film. There's just a person deciding whether his life will be predictable or demanding. Then comes a moment that turns the story from young professional with faith into man on a collision course. Accounts tied to his ministry describe a defining spiritual experience in May 1981, an 18-hour vision, and a sense of mandate. A calling framed as liberation from oppression through preaching the word of faith. Winner's Capella. +1. Pause there. Think about the audacity of that idea in a young man's mind. I have a mandate. Not I have a job. Not I have a plan. A mandate. As if heaven handed him a blueprint. And this is where his architecture background becomes more than trivia. It becomes metaphor. Because a mandate is basically a design brief. And once you have it, you don't unsee it. But mandates are expensive. They cost comfort. They cost reputation. They cost the quiet approval of people who like you better when you stay in your lane. So he resigns from that stable path and leans toward missionary work, toward ministry, toward the kind of life where your salary is faith, and your success depends on whether people believe the fire in your bones is real. Wikipedia. And now the rivalry becomes personal. Because in Nigeria's religious ecosystem, stepping into ministry isn't stepping into peace. It's stepping into competition. Not always official competition, not always shouted from rooftops, but real. Competition for attention, credibility, influence, and the most dangerous currency of all, testimony. The stories people repeat decide who becomes a man of God in the public imagination. And Oyedepo is entering a world where stories are weapons. If a person rises too fast, some will say, it's God. Others will say, it's manipulation. Others will say, it's something darker. So the young minister has a choice, perform or build. His path, at least in how it is presented by accounts of his early ministry, moves through organization, gathering, and structure. A meeting in May 1981 with a group that later becomes his powerhouse is described as part of the early formation period. Wikipedia. And then the public line becomes clearer. By December 11, 1983, Living Faith Church is associated with being founded, with Oyedepo as founder. Wikipedia. Notice the pacing. Vision, formation, foundation, blueprint, team, building. That's architecture again. But don't romanticize it too quickly, because this stage is not glamorous. New movements don't start with stadiums. They start with suspicion. People watch you like they're waiting for you to slip. Older religious institutions can treat you like an upstart. Rival ministries can treat you like a thief of members. Some will smile at your face and hope your legs get tired on the road home. And this is where the story gets emotionally sharp. Because you can't lead people if you're constantly performing for approval. So in this early period, the defining question isn't, how famous will Oyedepo become? It's, will he survive long enough to become anything at all? And survival in ministry isn't only about money. It's about stamina under pressure. It's about the loneliness of choosing a path that your former colleagues don't understand. It's about being called arrogant for having confidence, and being called weak for showing doubt. It's about the temptation to become the very thing you hate. Remember that bus scene? The envelope? The preacher's palm. That disgust. Here's the danger. Once you step into the religious marketplace, you can start rationalizing the marketplace. You can start telling yourself, this is how it works. And that is the real enemy in Act 1. Not a rival pastor's name, not a particular church. The enemy is the slippery slope, where conviction turns into branding, where a calling turns into a product. And for someone who will later be associated with a word of faith style of preaching, the line between inspiration and commercialization is always being debated around him, sometimes respectfully, sometimes brutally. Wikipedia. +1. So the tension rises even in the early years, because the young Oyedepo is not only building a ministry, he's building a definition of what ministry should be. And when you build definitions, you make enemies, because definitions are boundaries, and boundaries tell people, this is true, and that is not. Now add one more human layer. Family. Because behind the public figure, there is a man whose life is entwined with a partner. Accounts describe how he and his wife, Florence Abiola Akano, known as Faith Abiola Oyedepo, were ordained as pastors in September 1983 under the broader Christian leadership environment in Nigeria. Wikipedia, +1. That detail matters because movements are rarely carried by one spine alone. They are carried by households, by loyalty, by private conversations in rooms the public will never see. It's easy to respect a preacher when the lights are on. It's harder to respect him when the lights are off and the bills are due and the future feels like fog. This is where Act 1 closes its fist. A young architect-turned-minister is stepping away from stability into a battlefield of belief. He has a mandate in his head, discipline in his bones, and a country full of people desperate for hope and vulnerable to exploitation. And somewhere out there, the rival gospel is watching him too. Not because it loves him, but because if he succeeds, he becomes a mirror that exposes it. And mirrors make liars furious. The decision doesn't arrive like a clean letter on an office desk. It arrives like a fever. One day you're measuring walls, checking angles, signing forms, your life neatly boxed into career. And the next day, the same room feels too small to breathe in. The ceiling fan turns, but it's not cooling your mind. Every sound is louder. The scratch of a pen, the tap of a shoe, the dry cough of a coworker. And inside your chest, something keeps repeating a sentence you didn't invent. This is not what you were built for. Oyedepo's calling, at least in the way his story is told, doesn't feel like a hobby he tries on. It feels like a command he can't put down, not a polite suggestion. A mandate. A blueprint burned into him so hard that staying safe begins to feel like disobedience. And here's the first cruel twist of Act 2. The moment you claim God has sent you, the world doesn't clap. It sharpens its knives. Because Nigeria doesn't just have faith. It has religious warfare without bullets. Competition so intense it can split families, empty pockets, and turn neighbors into judges. In the streets and markets, people argue over the same question like it's a football rivalry. Which man of God is real? And what they mean by real is not always holiness. Sometimes they mean, who produces results fast? Who gets money? Who looks untouchable? So when Oyedepo begins to pivot from architecture and government work toward ministry, he's stepping into a ring where spectators love blood, not literal blood, but public failure, a collapse, a scandal, a humiliation. People like watching big voices fall because it confirms their own cynicism. See? They're all the same. And that's where the enemy, his true competitor, takes shape. Not one specific person you can sue. Not a single church you can debate. It's a whole industry of what you might call instant gratification spirituality, a gospel that sells shortcuts, a faith that promises, tomorrow morning. Miracles as if heaven is a vending machine with a broken refund policy. Oyedepo, shaped by discipline, enters the arena with a different fire. The idea of a covenant, a structured relationship with God, with principles, obedience, and consequences. Not a magician's trick, not a one-night performance. That difference doesn't just make him unique. It makes him dangerous. Because if people begin to believe faith is principled, they stop paying for drama. And drama is profitable. So the rivalry becomes inevitable. The builder versus the merchants. He leaves stability behind, and at first it doesn't look heroic. It looks reckless. No applause, no ceremonial send-off. Just a man and his conviction walking into uncertainty, like it's a room he has to furnish from scratch. And the earliest stage of the ministry is not grand. It's small rooms with plastic chairs. It's borrowed microphones that squeal like angry birds. It's long nights where you can feel the city's electricity, sometimes literally unstable, lights blinking like the whole neighborhood is breathing in and out. He begins gathering people, teaching, speaking, planting ideas in a soil that has been trampled by disappointment. And if you think the biggest problem is finding followers, you're underestimating the battlefield. The real first battles are brutal and intimate. The landlord who hears church and suddenly raises the rent. The neighbor who complains about noise because they hate the idea of someone else becoming influential. The friend who smiles while quietly waiting to say, "I told you it wouldn't work." The relative who warns, half caring and half insulting, don't become one of those men. Because the reputation of pastors, especially charismatic, growing pastors, is complicated. In the public imagination, the pastor can be a rescuer or a predator. And Oyedepo knows that. He carries that old disgust from his youth like a hidden scar. The memory of envelopes, the smell of manipulation, the way some people's eyes change when money enters a prayer. So he does something that becomes a defining pattern. He leans into certainty. He speaks like a man who has seen the blueprint and refuses to pretend otherwise. That attracts people. But it also attracts predators, because wherever there is influence, there are those who want to harvest it. Here's a twist you feel before you can prove it. When a new movement starts growing, the first helpers aren't always helpers. Some are scouts. Some are spies for rival ministries. Some are opportunists who want proximity to power. So the early days, before the massive auditoriums, before the global reputation, are full of quiet tests, small betrayals, whisper campaigns, the kind of character pressure that doesn't make the news but can break a human being. In this season, Oyedepo's approach becomes increasingly shaped by a single obsession. If my message is true, it must be repeatable. If it's repeatable, it must be teachable. If it's teachable, it must be written. So he begins producing teachings and materials, building a kind of ideological scaffolding around the movement, turning what could have been just a revival into a system. And the system, again, threatens the merchants. Because merchants sell moods, builders sell foundations. But a foundation doesn't protect you from storms. In fact, storms seem to show up faster when you claim you can withstand them. One night, imagine a small hall, fans turning lazily, people packed in. You can smell perfume and sweat and the sharp sweetness of cheap soft drinks. Someone is crying quietly in the second row, Real tears, not performance tears. In the back, a skeptic sits with arms crossed, ready to judge. And at the edge of the gathering, like a shadow with a smile, sits the competitor. Not necessarily a named rival you can point at, but the spirit of rivalry embodied in a kind of person. A man who has learned that the fastest way to win followers is to promise them speed. You don't need process, he suggests. You don't need discipline, he sneers. You just need a powerful man to activate your breakthrough. And he watches Oyedepo's meeting the way a hawk watches a small animal. Is this movement vulnerable? Can it be copied? Can it be stolen? Can it be discredited? Because in a crowded religious environment, copying is the highest compliment and the most violent attack. If they can't stop you, they imitate you. If they can't imitate you, they attack you. If they can't attack you openly, they whisper. So whispers begin. Too young. Too bold. Too sure. Who does he think he is? And here's where Oyedepo's personality, his intensity, becomes both weapon and risk. He isn't the kind of leader who begs to be liked. He's the kind who dares you to follow. That creates loyalty that feels like steel, and criticism that feels like poison. In the Nigerian context, where respect for authority can be deep but suspicion can be deeper, this is combustible. The movement begins to grow anyway, not because everyone agrees with him, but because something in his message meets people where they hurt. Nigeria is full of brilliant, hard-working people who still feel cursed by systems, corruption, scarcity, instability, family burdens, generational poverty. People don't just want prayer. They want escape routes. Oyedepo's message, framed in terms of faith, covenant, victory, sounds like an escape route with a map, and that is why many begin to honor him. He speaks to aspiration without apology. He talks about overcoming not as fantasy, but as something God wants for the believer. But the more he preaches victory, the more the enemy gospels try to hijack the word. The merchants take victory and turn it into payment. They turn covenant into transaction. They turn faith into fee. So the rivalry becomes ideological, like a war over meaning. And Oyedepo's mission, whether he says it in those exact words or not, becomes a fight to keep the faith from becoming a marketplace trick. Then comes a psychological turn that makes the story darker. Because as his influence expands, so does the temptation he once despised. Money enters the story not as evil, but as a test. When you're small, you can pretend you're pure, because you have no access. When you grow, purity becomes real work. People bring gifts, envelopes, offerings, and not all giving is innocent. Some people give to control you. Some give to buy proximity. Some give to purchase special prayer like it's a premium subscription. And at some point, the young leader faces the most dangerous moment in any spiritual empire's origin story. The moment you realize people will treat you like a solution, not like a teacher, not like a pastor, a solution. They'll kneel, not just to God, but to the idea that you are the shortcut to God. If you accept that worship, you become a king in a costume. If you reject it too harshly, you risk crushing the fragile hope of people who are clinging to you because life has already crushed them. So, what does a builder do? A builder channels the emotion into structure. More teaching, more doctrine, more insistence on principles, more, this is the way. Not because structure is cold, but because structure is what prevents a fire from burning down the house. Still, the opposition doesn't stop. And here's a twist that always hits hard in stories like this. The first serious enemy is rarely outside. It's usually inside. A close associate, someone trusted, someone who knows the routines, the habits, the weak points, begins to resent the center. It can happen quietly. A look held too long, a compliment that sounds slightly sour, a suggestion that is really a challenge. And then one day, something disappears. Maybe not money, maybe people. A group splits off. A rumor spreads. A new work starts in the same neighborhood with the same slogans, but with a different leader who claims he's been released to start his own ministry. To the public, it looks like normal church multiplication. To the person who built it, it feels like being robbed by someone who wore your uniform. That is how rivalries are born. Not in dramatic duels on stage, but in quiet betrayals over time. Now imagine Oyedepo's choice in that moment. He can chase them, fight publicly, name names, or he can outbuild them. And again, he chooses to build. He hardens the message, sharpens the identity, defines the mission more aggressively. This is where winners becomes more than a catchy label. It becomes an identity, a psychological uniform. Because in a country where many feel like victims of circumstances, winner isn't a compliment, it's a revolt. You can see how it spreads. You can see why it works. But you can also see why critics later call it dangerous. Because if you tell people they are winners, some will begin to treat suffering as shame and complexity as weakness. And so, without anyone announcing it, another conflict quietly enters the story. Not just rivalry with competitors, but rivalry with reality itself. Because real life doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes real life looks like grief, delay, unanswered prayers, the long, humiliating wait. So Act 2 becomes a test not only of Oyedepo's charisma, but of his theology under pressure. Can victory survive when nothing feels victorious? And then, like a scene meant to raise goosebumps, he doubles down on the idea of calling. When a person is truly convinced they've been sent, they behave differently. They speak differently. They take risks that make cautious people angry. To his supporters, that reads as faith. To his enemies, it reads as arrogance. And Nigeria is a place where arrogance, real or perceived, can invite backlash. The backlash doesn't always come with fists. Sometimes it comes as bureaucracy, obstruction, inspections, random regulations, sudden restrictions on gatherings. The subtle pressure of a system that can squeeze you without leaving fingerprints. And yet the gatherings continue. Because when people taste hope, they defend it like food. The crowd grows. The hunger grows. And with growth comes a new, almost cinematic problem. The leader's voice becomes too important. If Oyedepo stops, the machine could stall. If he falters, the movement could fracture. If he dies, people might scatter like birds. So to survive, the movement needs to become more than one man's lungs. That's when training, ordination, expansion, institutionalizing the vision become necessary, not as vanity, but as survival strategy. The builder starts laying roads, and the competitor, still watching, changes tactics. Because when you can't stop a movement with mockery, you try to stain it with scandal. So whispers evolve into accusations. Money. Control. Power. Some accusations are standard for any growing ministry. Others are sharper, more personal, designed to make people feel dirty for even attending. It becomes psychological warfare. Make the believer feel foolish. Make the follower feel ashamed. Make the listener feel suspicious of their own hope. And this is where Oyedepo's most controversial strength becomes visible. His refusal to shrink. He doesn't retreat into apologizing. He doesn't soften his edges to be more palatable. He keeps preaching with the posture of a man who believes the world is negotiable through faith. That posture becomes addictive for supporters. Because when you live in uncertainty, certainty feels like oxygen. And that, right there, is one of the reasons he becomes deeply honored in Nigeria. Not merely because he built a large church, but because he embodied a kind of spiritual boldness that many Nigerians admire. An insistence that destiny is not only endured, but confronted. People begin to attach their personal comebacks to his message. They tell stories. I was nothing. I was stuck. I was finished. Then I heard this and something shifted. Testimonies multiply and testimonies are fuel. But every fuel can explode. Because the more people credit you for their turnaround, the heavier your shadow becomes. And under that shadow, you can't be just human anymore. You're expected to be an answer machine. That pressure can make a preacher crack, or it can make him become a fortress. Oyedepo becomes more fortress-like, more intense, more certain, more uncompromising. And by the end of this part of the story, you can feel the trajectory. This isn't going to stay small. The builder has laid enough concrete that the next phase won't be a local movement. It's about to become an empire of influence, with all the glory and danger that comes with it. Because when your enemy is an industry, the only way to beat it is to scale faster than it can copy you. And that is exactly where we're headed next. The first time you walk into a Winners Chapel service at full heat, it doesn't feel like a church gathering. It feels like you've stepped into a living engine. There's the sound before you even see the room, drums rolling like distant thunder, keyboards shimmering, voices stacking on top of each other until the air itself seems to vibrate. People aren't sitting like they're waiting for a lecture. They're standing, clapping, moving, some with eyes shut tight, some staring forward like they're daring life to challenge them. And then comes the first thing that surprises outsiders. It's not soft. It's not shy. It's not the polite kind of faith that stays in its lane. It's aggressive, like a courtroom argument where somebody is finally presenting evidence that their life should not remain broken. Because in Oyedepo's world, worship is not just music. It's a weapon. You hear phrases that sound like battle language: victory, breakthrough, dominion, covenant, inheritance. And when you don't understand the background of Nigeria, how many people wake up already tired, already behind, already carrying the weight of family, bills, uncertainty? Those words can sound like hype. But when you do understand the background, those words land differently. They land like oxygen. Then the service moves with a kind of choreography that feels engineered, almost architectural. There's praise that lifts the mood into motion. There's worship that slows it into something deeper. Voices softening, hands rising, faces wet, the room turning intimate even when thousands are present. Then comes the declarations. Statements said out loud, repeated, sharpened, like the crowd is hammering a new identity into place. And right there, right in the middle of that rhythm, you can see the builder at work. Because this is not a random revival. It's a system. The system is designed to do something very specific. Take people who feel powerless and train them, emotionally, spiritually, mentally, to see themselves as people who can win, and the competitor, his rival gospel, hates that. Because the rival gospel doesn't want you trained. It wants you dependent. It wants you addicted to the next special meeting, the next seed, the next paid prophecy, the next shortcut. So the war is not just between churches. It's between two psychological futures. One future says, "You are a project. I will keep fixing you for a price." The other says, "You are a winner. Stand up. Learn. Grow. Take responsibility. Fight." This is why Oyedepo's influence spreads. It's not just charisma. It's an identity factory. But identity factories produce two things at once: believers and enemies. As the movement grows, the spaces it inhabits start getting too small. The crowd becomes a problem. Ironically, the kind of problem any leader would want, until it becomes dangerous. Too many bodies in cramped halls. Too much noise for neighbors. Too much attention. And attention in Nigeria can feel like sunlight and sniper scopes at the same time. Then comes a move that feels like a cinematic pivot. Land. Not a symbolic spiritual land. Actual land. A place outside the city's squeeze. A place where the movement can build without begging. Where it can expand like a living organism, finally given room to breathe. So the church acquires a huge property on the outskirts of Ota, near Lagos, what becomes known as Canaan land. Even the name is a statement. It's not subtle. It's a claim, and claims attract challenge. Because when you name land after promise, the world tests whether you deserve it. Then the builder does what builders do. He builds something that looks impossible. A sanctuary so vast that describing it to someone who's never seen it can sound like exaggeration. A place designed to hold tens of thousands, an auditorium that becomes famous for its scale, completed in a startlingly short period of time, and dedicated in 1999. Now, here's where you can almost hear the competitor's teeth grind. Because once you can gather that many people under one roof, you can reshape culture. You don't just lead a congregation, you influence a national conversation. And with that kind of influence, the attacks change flavor. When you're small, rivals mock you. When you're medium, rivals copy you. When you're huge, rivals try to stain you. So rumors start traveling faster than sermons. He's too powerful. He's too rich. He's building an empire. He's manipulating people. Some of those accusations are the predictable backlash that any megachurch leader faces. Some are nastier, carefully designed to trigger disgust in the public, the same disgust Oyedepo felt as a boy watching money change hands in the name of God. And that's the twist. The enemy tries to beat him using his own old wound. They want the public to look at Winners Chapel and feel what that teenage boy felt on the bus. Is this holy? Or is this a business in religious clothing? Oyedepo's response isn't to shrink the movement until it looks humble. He goes the opposite direction. He doubles down on structure, on scale, on certainty. Because in his worldview, shrinking under pressure rewards the bully, and he refuses to reward the bully. Then comes another massive lever of influence. Gatherings that aren't just services but events. Religious festivals that feel like national moments. Shiloh. If you've never seen footage of it, imagine a human ocean, faces stretching into the distance, lights, screens, songs, the atmosphere of a stadium, but with prayers instead of chants for a football team. People travel in from different regions, different countries, hungry for encounters, hungry for a turning point. And here's the part outsiders underestimate. Shiloh is not only about excitement, it's about story. Because in a place where many people feel like life has been a series of closed doors, a big gathering becomes a place where they can narrate a new chapter. They come carrying private shame, debts, sickness, family troubles, and they want to leave carrying a different label. Testimony. Testimony is currency in this world. The competitor understands that too, so he tries to counterfeit it. He creates his own special nights, his own prophetic seasons, his own mantle moments, promising faster results, louder miracles, more dramatic deliverance. He tells people, in effect, why sit in a crowd and wait your turn? Come to me. I'll put you on the fast track. And for people in pain, the fast track is tempting. So the rivalry becomes a tug-of-war over urgency. Oyedepo's camp emphasizes principles. Covenant practice, giving as worship, obedience, faith spoken aloud, disciplined belief. The competitor emphasizes spectacle, instant miracles, private access, special consultations, the idea that proximity to the man is the secret key. And the battle line becomes clear in the way the services are structured. In Winners Chapel, the service is designed so people participate, not just watch. The crowd doesn't come as an audience. It comes as an army being drilled. You hear phrases like, stand to your feet, declare, engage, take it. People are taught to speak back to circumstances as if circumstances have ears. For some, it feels empowering, like learning to drive after being a passenger your whole life. For others, it feels intense, like being pushed into a fight you didn't ask for. And that intensity is part of why he's revered. In Nigeria, many admire leaders who look fearless, leaders who talk like they can't be intimidated by poverty, sickness, or politics. Oyedepo's preaching style is built for that admiration. He often doesn't sound like someone hoping. He sounds like someone announcing, not maybe, not let's see, more like, this is the law of this kingdom. That tone is magnetic. It's also controversial, because when you speak in absolutes, you inspire the desperate, and you provoke the skeptical. And skepticism in a religious environment isn't always quiet. Sometimes it's aggressive. By now, the movement isn't just a church. It's becoming an ecosystem. And here's a twist that shifts the story again. Education. Because once a movement controls education, it can shape generations. So the church's influence stretches beyond Sunday services into institutions, most notably universities associated with the movement. Covenant University and later Landmark University. This is where the builder's mind becomes undeniable. A preacher building a university is not thinking only about sermons. He's thinking about legacy, leadership pipelines, social engineering. Supporters see it as nation building, creating disciplined leaders, excellence culture, values-based education, Critics see danger, blending spiritual authority with institutional power. Either way, the result is the same. His influence moves from the pulpit into the future, and that makes his rival gospel nervous. Because the rival gospel thrives on short attention spans. It thrives on people who remain in cycles of crisis and dependence. Education, real, disciplined education, threatens the crisis cycle. So the competitor's next tactic isn't only to accuse Oyedepo of chasing money. It's to question his right to shape society. You're not just preaching, the enemy implies. You're taking over. And this is where the story becomes more than personal. It becomes political without being a political office. Because in Nigeria, religion is social power, and social power attracts both admiration and fear. Now watch how Oyedepo's public image evolves in this season. He becomes, to supporters, a symbol of what Nigerians call grace, not merely spiritual grace, but the idea that someone can rise beyond limitations and drag others upward behind them. People honor him because he represents scale. Scale is a language Nigerians understand deeply. When a nation has struggled with infrastructure and systems, a leader who builds massive functioning structures feels like proof that it can be done. It's not just the message, it's the visible evidence. Land, buildings, organization, events that run like machinery, a brand that's recognizable. But the same scale that produces honor also produces disgust in some observers. Because scale in religion raises a hard question. Where does God end and business begin? Oyedepo's critics sharpen that question like a blade. And the builder responds not by becoming smaller, but by becoming more prolific. He teaches constantly, writes books, creates training materials, builds leadership layers, expands branches internationally. The message turns into a global export. Winners chapel across countries, services held in different cities, a network that feels like a franchise to skeptics and like a family to believers. And inside this expansion, you can feel the tension inside Oyedepo himself, the tension every empire builder faces. If you slow down, you lose momentum. If you keep speeding up, you risk becoming a machine. A machine can win, but a machine can also crush people. So here's another twist. The movement's success creates pressure on the people inside it. Not everyone thrives under winner language. Some people begin to hide their struggles because they don't want to look like failures in a culture of victory. Some feel guilt for being depressed, ashamed for being broke, embarrassed for being sick, because the public language is so triumphant. And that creates a quiet underground in the story. Unspoken pain under loud celebration. Oyedepo's sermons, in their boldness, can sometimes sound like they leave no room for fragility. Supporters call that faith. Critics call it toxicity. Many regular people just call it heavy. But even that heaviness is part of what keeps people coming. Because in an unstable environment, a heavy system can feel like safety. Then the competitor tries something more direct. He attempts to steal not just followers, but meaning. He starts preaching victory, too. He starts calling his people winners, too. He starts copying the phrases, the rhythm, the posture. But there's a problem with copying a builder. You can imitate the paint. You can't imitate the foundation, so the counterfeit begins to wobble. A scandal erupts. Maybe not one that makes international headlines, but one that spreads through whispers and WhatsApp messages like fire. The competitor is accused of taking money, of abusing trust, of selling access. And even if some details are exaggerated, as rumors often are, something real happens in the public mind. People begin to compare. They look at the competitor's chaos and look back at Oyedepo's structure. And structure, in a world addicted to spectacle, looks like credibility. So the rivalry doesn't end with a public victory speech. It ends the way most rivalries end in real life. One side becomes stable enough that people stop doubting it will last. That stability turns into reverence. But Oyedepo's story doesn't become soft here. It becomes sharper. Because when a movement becomes huge, the leader's words can spark consequences. A sentence spoken in one sermon can travel across the nation, clipped into a short video, stripped of context, and used as ammunition. Either to inspire or to condemn, So every sermon becomes high stakes. Every phrase can be called prophetic or reckless. And the honor he receives in Nigeria is partly because, despite that risk, he keeps speaking with the same fearless tone. People admire that consistency, especially in a society where many leaders, religious or political, bend with the wind. To honor Oyedepo for many Nigerians is to honor the idea that a person can stand for something and build it big. Yet at the same time, his critics, sometimes sincere, sometimes hostile, keep circling one point. Is this faith or is this power? Is the winner message freeing people or pressuring them? That unresolved tension is not a bug in his story. It's the engine. Because polarization keeps attention, and attention keeps influence. So by the end of this part of the narrative, you don't just have a preacher who grew a church. You have a man who built a spiritual industrial ecosystem, worship as warfare, preaching as architecture, events as mass psychology, institutions as legacy machines, while fighting a constant ideological war against the counterfeit gospel that tries to turn faith into a shortcut shop. And now the story is standing at a cliff edge. Because when a leader becomes a symbol, the question is no longer, can he build? The question becomes, what happens to a nation of followers when the symbol becomes larger than life? That's where we go next. The older a symbol becomes, the more the world tries to pull the mask off, whether there's a mask or not. In Oyedepo's case, time doesn't soften the argument around him. It sharpens it. Because now the question isn't, can this movement survive? It has survived. The question is, what survival turns you into. A man can start as a messenger and end up a monument. And monuments are strange. People decorate them with their hopes, their anger, their conspiracy theories, their hunger for certainty. They don't see stone anymore. They see what they need to see. So, as the years stack, Oyedepo steps into that dangerous role, less like a pastor you can meet, and more like a figure people interpret. Wikipedia. And interpretation can turn love into worship, and suspicion into obsession. You can feel it in the way people talk about him in Nigeria, with an intensity that feels almost tribal. To supporters, he's proof that faith can build systems, not just feelings. He's the man who taught them to stop apologizing for wanting a better life, who trained them to speak like winners even when their pockets were empty and their families were heavy. To critics, he's proof of something else, that religion in Nigeria can become a ladder to power, polished, protected, untouchable, while ordinary people keep paying the price of hope. And the truth is, both sides are reacting to something real, because the longer a movement lasts, the more it must answer an uncomfortable question. Is this about God, or is this about the man who represents God? That question becomes a knife edge when the man is still alive, still preaching, still declaring new seasons like a general announcing campaigns. Instagram +1. And yes, he is still alive as of now, still publicly active, still very much in the arena. Instagram +1. So the death in this final stretch of the story isn't a news headline. It's something more inevitable and more frightening. It's the death of the original version of a leader, the moment the movement becomes bigger than the human being who started it. Because once that happens, even if the founder keeps breathing, he starts getting treated like he's already a legend. And legends are dangerous to be around. People either kneel too easily or throw stones too eagerly. Here's the visual. Late night in a massive compound, quiet in the way big places can be quiet. Security lights humming, distant footsteps, and the soft roar of generators somewhere far away. In a smaller private room, a man sits alone with documents, not sermons, documents, schedules, successions, names, roles. Because empires don't collapse only from external attack. They collapse when the center becomes a single point of failure. A movement built on one voice eventually has to ask, what happens when the voice is tired? What happens when the voice is silent? What happens when the voice is gone? This is the part that rarely makes the highlight reels. People think legacy is built on stadium moments and fiery declarations. But legacy is mostly built on boring, brutal decisions. Who leads next? Who controls money? Who controls doctrine? Who controls the image? Who gets removed when they become a threat? And threats don't always come from enemies outside. Sometimes the threat is the people closest to you. Those who know the passwords, the routines, the quiet weaknesses. People who smile while measuring your shadow, waiting for the moment it becomes theirs. So if you want the real tension of Act 3, it isn't the screaming crowd. It's succession. Because the moment a leader becomes too big to replace, the movement becomes fragile. And the rivals, those who have been watching for decades, those who tried to copy the slogans and steal the rhythm, can smell fragility. The way sharks smell blood, they begin to position themselves not as competitors anymore, but as alternatives. They start whispering, "After him, where will they go? When he's gone, the people will scatter. His church will split. His sons will fight. The empire will eat itself." That's how rivals speak when they can't beat you in the present. They try to win your future. Oyedepo's defenders often point to a different story. Not just a man preaching, but a machine of training, layers of leadership, systems of teaching, institutions that outlive a single personality, a builder's instinct. Don't just create applause, create replacement parts. This is also why his family becomes part of the public narrative. His wife, his children, the visible sense that a legacy is being guarded, not just enjoyed. Wikipedia. But here's where it gets messy, and this is where the mixed feelings you asked for return. Because succession in a religious empire can feel like two opposite things at once. On one hand, it looks like wisdom, continuity, stability, a plan. On the other hand, it can look like monarchy, power staying in the bloodline, the pulpit turning into inheritance. And that's the taste of disgust that some Nigerians can't ignore, because they've seen too many national systems run like private property. So, whether you honor him or doubt him, you can't deny what he represents. Religion as institution. And that brings us to another quiet battlefield. Money. Not because money is automatically evil, but because money in the hands of a religious institution becomes a moral spotlight. People start asking questions that are never asked when a poor pastor rides a public bus. Where did the wealth come from? Who benefits? Who gets helped? Who gets hurt? Is giving truly voluntary when it's preached as a spiritual law? And then there is the sharpest question of all. What happens to the believer who gives and still suffers? Because the winner language can inspire greatness, but it can also suffocate vulnerability. It can create a culture where people feel they must smile through pain so they won't be accused, by others or by themselves, of lacking faith. That's the shadow side of a victory-centered message. Even when the message is sincere, the human mind can twist it into pressure. You can imagine a woman sitting in a service, face steady, hands raised, mouth repeating declarations, while inside she's thinking, "If I admit I'm drowning, will they treat me like a failure?" That is the invisible cost of triumphant religion. And if you're telling this story honestly, you don't cut that out. You let it sit there like a stone in the throat. Because it's part of why Oyedepo is so debated. People don't argue about leaders who are irrelevant. They argue about leaders who shape how millions think, give, obey, dream. Now, why is he honored in Nigeria, even with the controversy? Because in a society where many leaders promise and never build, he built. He built a brand of faith that feels like a weapon against limitation, and Nigerians, especially those who have fought their way through scarcity, tend to respect fighters. The vibe is not pity me. The vibe is, watch me. And there's something else Nigerians honor, sometimes even more than gentleness. Results. Not only results in money, results in organization, results in scale, results in consistency. The ability to create a system that actually runs. That's why, in the public imagination, Oyedepo isn't just a preacher. He's a prototype, a Nigerian who carved an empire from conviction and structure. Even those who dislike him often speak about him with a certain reluctant acknowledgement. The way you talk about a storm, you don't. Respect, but you respect its power. And, in an environment crowded with spiritual performers, many see him as a figure of spiritual seriousness, someone with discipline, repetition, long-term thinking, and a message that doesn't apologize for being ambitious. His supporters don't honor him because they think he's perfect. They honor him because they believe he's effective, and because they have personally attached their turning points to his teachings. Wikipedia people don't just follow sermons. They follow narratives that give them a new identity. But here's the next twist. The higher you go, the less your enemies need to destroy you. Sometimes they just need to make you ridiculous. So the rival camp, the counterfeit gospel, the merchants, shifts into a smarter strategy. Memes, clips, edits, out-of-context lines. They don't try to debate theology. They try to make the public laugh at the man. Because laughter is a cheap kind of assassination. When people laugh at a spiritual leader, the leader's authority leaks. So clips circulate, headlines, snippets. People who never attended a service begin to build an opinion from a 12-second video. And the disgust returns, again. Because in a nation where people are tired, a rich-looking preacher can become an easy symbol of injustice. That's not always fair. But it is real. And it's part of why Oyedepo's story is so emotionally charged. He stands at the intersection of hope and resentment, faith and economics, aspiration and suspicion. He can preach deliverance to one person and sound like provocation to another. Now, let's talk about the kind of death that truly completes this narrative, without inventing a physical death that hasn't happened. It's the death every founder must face if their work is truly bigger than ego, the death of being needed. If Oyedepo's legacy is strong, the movement will continue to grow even when he is no longer the central engine. If his legacy is weak, it will fracture into factions the moment the founding voice weakens. And this is where his rivals are still waiting, still patient, still hungry. Because if the movement ever shows a crack, one public leadership struggle, one major scandal, one generational dispute, the competitors won't even need to attack. They'll simply open their arms and say, "Come." That is the long game. So what does Oyedepo's life mean, in the end? It means Nigeria witnessed a man who treated religion like architecture, blueprint, foundation, repetition, systems. He turned sermons into identity, worship into warfare, and gatherings into a pipeline that can produce loyalty at scale. If you honor him, you will call this nation building. If you hate him, you will call it empire building. If you are honest, you will admit it is both. Because human beings rarely build anything large without mixing vision and ambition. And there's one more uncomfortable truth Nigerians sense, even if they never say it out loud. A leader like Oyedepo doesn't just reflect Nigeria. He reveals Nigeria. He reveals a nation desperate enough for hope that it will travel hours, give sacrificially, cry in crowds, cling to declarations. Because the alternative is despair. He reveals a nation ambitious enough to worship winning, because losing has been too common and too humiliating. He reveals a nation spiritual enough to believe that invisible forces matter, because visible systems have often failed them. So, why is he honored? Because many Nigerians see him as a living contradiction to their limitations, proof that a Nigerian can build something disciplined, global, massive, and lasting from a spiritual idea. Wikipedia. And why is he controversial? Because many Nigerians fear what happens when spiritual authority becomes so large it feels untouchable. Because untouchable systems, in Nigeria, have historically been dangerous. That tension, honor and suspicion, will follow his name long after any single sermon is forgotten. And that is the final image. Not a man in a pulpit, but a shadow stretching across a nation. Some people standing inside that shadow feeling protected, others standing outside it feeling chilled, everyone unable to pretend they didn't see it.